I didn't know that 12 months later, 17 people who laughed at me that night would be standing outside my locked front gate, begging a security guard to let them in. I didn't know that my own wife would be the one crying the hardest. But to understand how we got there, you need to hear what happened at that dinner table first, because that's where everything started, and that's where I made a decision nobody at that table saw coming. My name is Julian Voss, and for 6 years, I was married to a woman named Kendra. Smart, sharp, ambitious. The kind of woman who could walk into any room and make it hers within 30 seconds. I fell for that. Hard. What I didn't fall for, not at first anyway, was her family. Her mother ran the family like a corporation, and her younger sister, Priya, treated every gathering like an audition for cruelty. I worked from home. Quietly. Building something most of them never bothered to ask about. To them, I was just Kendra's husband who does something with computers. That description followed me to every holiday, every birthday, every family dinner for 6 straight years. That particular night was Kendra's mother's 60th birthday. 17 family members packed around a long wooden table at an upscale restaurant, wine flowing, laughter echoing off the walls. I sat near the end, mostly quiet, the way I usually was at these things, half listening to the noise around me. Then Priya leaned across the table, wine glass in hand, and asked the question that changed everything. "So Julian," she said, loud enough that conversations around us actually paused, "if Kendra ever cheated on you with, like, her boss or something, would you actually cry? Like, would we see tears?" I remember the way she smiled when she said it. Not a joke smile. A testing smile. The kind of smile people wear when they already know something you don't. The table erupted. Actual laughter, rolling down both sides like a wave. Someone's fork clinked against a glass. An uncle nearly choked on his drink. And Kendra, my wife, sitting 2 seats away from me, smirked, took a slow sip of wine, and said, loud enough for the whole table to hear clearly, "He's basically a statue in bed anyway." I doubt he'd notice. More laughter. Louder this time. I watched faces around that table, people I'd shared 6 Christmases with, 6 birthdays, 6 years of quiet politeness, laughing at me like I was the evening's entertainment. I didn't yell. I didn't storm out. I did something that confused every single person at that table far more than an outburst ever could have. I nodded slowly. I raised my fork, like I was toasting the joke itself. And I said one word. Understood. Then I finished my meal. If you think that's the end of the story, stay with me, because that dinner was only the first domino. What happened over the following weeks is the part nobody at that table ever expected, and if revenge stories like this one keep your attention the way they keep mine, go ahead and hit subscribe now, because the next part is where things get genuinely unbelievable. I want to back up for a second, because understood wasn't a random word. It was the trigger word I'd been quietly building toward for almost a year, without even fully admitting it to myself until that exact moment. See, the "statue in bed" comment wasn't news to me. I'd suspected for months that Kendra's late nights with her boss, a man named Desmond Fry, weren't just about quarterly reports. I'd noticed the perfume that wasn't hers on her jacket. The new lock code on her phone. The way she'd angle her screen away from me at dinner. I told myself I was imagining things, the way people do when the alternative feels too heavy to hold. That comment at the table wasn't the moment I found out. It was the moment I stopped pretending I hadn't already found out. I drove home that night in silence while Kendra chatted with her sister on speakerphone about how good the food was, completely unaware that the man sitting beside her had already spent the last 3 weeks quietly documenting everything. Here's where I need to tell you something about myself that most people at that dinner table didn't know, because I never talked about my work. I didn't build websites. I didn't do something with computers, in the vague, forgettable way Kendra's family liked to describe it. 4 years earlier, I'd built a small cybersecurity consulting firm from a spare bedroom, and by the time of that dinner, it was quietly handling digital forensics contracts for 2 regional banks and an insurance litigation firm. I knew exactly how to trace a digital trail. I knew exactly how to build an airtight case. And for 3 weeks before that dinner, I'd already been doing exactly that, using every skill I had, on my own marriage. I had hotel records. I had email metadata showing Desmond Fry had transferred company funds to cover certain business trips that were never actually business trips. I had geotagged photos Kendra thought she'd deleted. I had more evidence sitting in an encrypted folder than most divorce attorneys see in a decade of cases. I hadn't confronted her yet. I was waiting. Building the full picture before I moved. That dinner, that public humiliation in front of 17 people, was supposed to be just another normal night for her. She had no idea it would be the last normal night of her old life. The next morning, while Kendra slept in after the party, I met with a divorce attorney named Ms. Calloway, a sharp, efficient woman who looked at my folder of evidence and simply said, "This is one of the cleanest cases I've seen in years." Within 72 hours, filing paperwork was already in motion. But I didn't tell Kendra any of this yet. Instead, I did something that, looking back, might be the most deliberate thing I've ever done in my life. I played normal. For 2 full weeks, I smiled at breakfast. I asked about her day. I let her believe understood had simply been me swallowing another humiliation the way I always did. Meanwhile, quietly, methodically, I moved. I transferred my business assets, already legally separate, fully out of any joint exposure. I contacted the insurance litigation firm I consulted for and mentioned, casually, that Desmond Fray's name had come up in an unrelated financial irregularity pattern I'd noticed. That single conversation, I later learned, triggered an internal audit at Kendra's company that neither she nor Desmond saw coming. I sold the vacation property Kendra's family had gifted us for our 3rd anniversary, technically registered solely in my name due to a tax structuring decision years earlier that nobody in her family had bothered to actually read the paperwork on. I quietly began the process of buying a new home, under a private trust, far outside Kendra's radar. For 2 weeks, while her family believed I was still the same quiet, forgettable statue they mocked at dinner, I was dismantling every piece of financial and emotional leverage Kendra's world had ever assumed I depended on. If you're wondering whether Kendra noticed anything during those 2 weeks, the answer is almost. Almost noticed the new folder icons on my desktop. Almost asked why I'd been on so many calls with someone named Calloway. Almost caught the moving truck quote sitting in my email drafts. But every time she got close, I redirected her with the same calm, boring normalcy I'd perfected for 6 years of being underestimated. Then came the night everything moved. I didn't announce it. I didn't give a speech. I simply packed 2 suitcases while Kendra was out at another one of her work dinners with Desmond, left the finalized divorce papers on the kitchen counter next to her favorite mug, and drove to the new house that, as of that afternoon, was already legally mine and mine alone. I blocked her number. I blocked her mother. I blocked Priya. I blocked every single person from that dinner table who had laughed at me like I was furniture in the room. I didn't post anywhere. I didn't explain myself to mutual friends. I simply vanished from that entire world, the way you delete a file you never planned to open again. For 12 months, I lived quietly. My business grew, mostly because I finally had the mental space to focus on it fully instead of managing the exhausting emotional labor of a marriage built on mockery. I dated a little, cautiously. I rebuilt, slowly, the version of myself that had been shrinking politely at family dinners for 6 years. I heard fragments, occasionally, through mutual acquaintances who hadn't gotten the block memo yet. Kendra's divorce settlement had been, in Ms. Calloway's words, surgically thorough. The financial cushion she'd always assumed our marriage provided simply evaporated the moment the paperwork finalized. Desmond Fry, it turned out, had been quietly under internal investigation at his company for months, a case that expanded significantly once auditors started pulling threads I'd casually pointed them toward. He was let go under circumstances that made him, apparently, radioactive in the industry. Kendra, once tied publicly and financially to both of us, found herself standing in the wreckage of 2 collapsed foundations at once. But here's the twist, the part one genuinely didn't see coming when I first started building all of this. About 11 months after that dinner, I got a call, not from Kendra, but from an unexpected number belonging to her mother's longtime housekeeper, a woman named Marta who'd always been kind to me over the years, one of the few people at those family gatherings who never once laughed along with the mockery. She told me, quietly, almost apologetically, that Kendra's mother's health had taken a serious turn, and that the family's finances, heavily entangled with a business investment Kendra's mother had made years earlier, co-signed partly through property that, coincidentally, traced back to paperwork connected to my old consulting work for a regional bank, were now under serious strain. Marta wasn't asking me for anything. She just felt, in her words, that someone should tell me, since the family refused to reach out themselves after everything that happened. I sat with that information for a long time. I want to be honest with you, a small, petty part of me felt something like satisfaction. But a much larger part of me felt something more complicated, watching an entire family structure that had once felt so untouchable, so confidently cruel, crumble under the weight of choices that, ultimately, had very little to do with me at all. 12 months to the day after that dinner, almost exactly, I got a notification from my new home security system. Someone was at the gate. Multiple someones, actually. When I pulled up the camera feed, I recognized them immediately. Priya. Kendra's mother, visibly thinner, leaning on a cane I'd never seen before. Kendra herself, standing slightly apart from the group, staring directly into the camera like she somehow knew I was watching. The security guard's voice crackled through the intercom, asking if I wanted them let in. I sat there for a long moment, watching 17 months of memories flicker across a small screen, watching the woman who once called me a statue in front of a laughing table now standing outside a gate she couldn't get past, waiting for a word from a man she'd once assumed would always be too quiet, too forgettable, too much of a statue, to ever actually move. I picked up the intercom, and I said one word. Understood. Then I turned the feed off, and I finished my dinner. I think about that night sometimes, the 2 very different meanings that single word carried, once as quiet humiliation swallowed for the sake of peace, and once as absolute, permanent closure. I don't regret either version of myself completely, honestly, because both versions taught me something important. The first version taught me what it feels like to be underestimated by people who claim to love you. The second version taught me what happens when you finally stop needing their laughter, their approval, their table, at all. If there's a lesson worth taking from all of this, I think it's simply that the quietest people in the room are often building something far bigger than anyone bothered to notice, and that the day you stop needing a seat at a table that mocks you is the day that table loses every bit of power it ever had over you. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever swallowed a humiliation while quietly planning your exit, I'd genuinely love to hear about it in the comments below. And if you want more stories exactly like this one, make sure you're subscribed, because there are plenty more coming. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you in the next story.